Welcome to this edition of Theological Journal's Global Anglican, the spring edition, Origen, Homilies on the Psalms. This is the first translation of a collection of 29 unknown homilies of Origen on the Psalms, which were found in the Bavarian State Library in 2012. Lost ancient books reappear only rarely, especially runs as long as this. According to the published letter by the Bavarian State Library, the importance of this find for scholarship cannot be overestimated. This is the last known work that Origen produced, and thus reveals the maturity of his thought. The monograph consists mostly of Origen's allegorical or symbolic interpretations of the Psalms, with one figurative exegesis after another. This collection well illustrates the whole and the details of the allegorical or figurative method of scriptural exegesis, long associated with Origen's name. In homilies on the Psalms, he often states the basis and utility of this allegorical method and gives reasons why a text should be interpreted allegorically rather than literally. Also notable are Origen's perceptive use of words and astuteness in picking up subtleties in the wording of the Psalms. Origen occasionally considers interpretations other than his own. The translator's footnotes in themselves merit acquiring the book, often occupying a quarter or a third of the page, although they also provide a wealth of knowledge to advanced scholars. They are so thorough explanations of the text and its sources that this monograph would do well as an introductory text to post-secondary students. The footnotes explain most of the questions that a beginner might have. Tigg's introduction provides an excellent outline of Hellenistic and early Christian methods of interpretation, including literary criticism. Tigg offers more explanatory footnotes that clarify the meaning and import of the Greek words he used than do other present-day translators, and about the language and social conditions familiar to Origen's hearers. The footnotes discuss philosophers and commentators and other sources prior to Origen to more fully explain his meanings. For instance, he reminds us in context that Origen assumed his listeners possessed a much greater familiarity with the biblical text than do Christian audiences of the 21st century. Some footnotes indicate the sources to which Origen made allusions. Some clarify the meaning and circumstances of the verse of the Psalms discussed, and nuances of Origen's departure from standard Greek vocabulary. Tigg mentions various interpretations whenever they occur from the Greek. His notes draw comparisons to the thought of Plato and other philosophers with Origen, and better explain Origen's thought. Tigg cross-references some other homilies in the monograph, indicating he possesses mastery of the whole and the work ethic to draw out their relationship. Unlike some other modern translations of Origen, this collection with the translator's notes are a good introduction and starting point to studying Origen and his work. Global Anglicanism Summer Edition. And we start with a new article by Lionel, Windsor, obedience and submission in 1 Peter. Obedience and submission are pervasive concepts in 1 Peter, but are often misunderstood. This article explains the meaning of these terms in the ancient world generally, and in 1 Peter in particular. Obedience means heeding the gospel message, that is conversion. The verb often translated disobey refers to being unpersuaded by the gospel. To submit means to voluntarily place oneself in an ordered relationship. This involves preserving the integrity of the relationship and honoring the person in authority. It does not imply grudgingly following specific orders, suppressing one's will in favor of another's, or tolerating abuse. This explication or exploration leads us to question the adequacy of prevailing post-colonial interpretation, which focuses on strategies of surviving and resisting systemic injustice in human institutions, empire, slavery, patriarchy. The post-colonial focus too easily obscures Peter's focus on Christ's redemption and on God as creator in general. Reading 1 Peter in church and world. Obedience and submission are pervasive concepts in 1 Peter. For those who accept this letter as God's authoritative word, it's important to understand how Peter is using these concepts, at least because they have significant implications for day-to-day relationships involving power and authority. For example, the 1662 Book of Common Prayer form of solemnization of matrimony, a service deeply rooted in the high view of Scripture. The wife pledges to obey her husband, using a term that occurs in the New Testament with reference to wives only in 1 Peter 3:6. Although the precise word is seldom used today, the BCP remains a fundamental standard of doctrine and worship for Anglicans worldwide. Hence, it's important to understand what Peter means and does not mean by the term obey. The same goes for the related term submit, which Peter uses in his discussions of various human relationships. Yet exegesis, interpretation, and pastoral application are often hard to disentangle, especially in these areas. If we are not careful, we can unintentionally impose 21st century assumptions and meanings on our understanding of Peter's first century terms. Consequently, when we come to explain and apply Peter's text, we can end up applying what we have inadvertently imported into the text, rather than being formed and challenged by the text. Furthermore, our hearers may reject the authority of the text, not because of what Peter is actually saying, which may be challenging enough, but because of the pain and anger caused by applying what Peter is wrongly heard to be saying. Now we turn to Hedgehog, a new article, Vladimir and Volodymyr, a pivotal moment in history by Martha Bayles, who teaches humanities at Boston College and is a fellow at the Institute of Advanced Studies in Culture. Martha Bayles, Vladimir, published in 1953, The Captive Mind, remains possibly the best book ever written about the lure and trap of totalitarian ideology. In his riveting collection of linked essays, the great poet Czesław Milosz probed the motivations of Polish writers and intellectuals who joined the communist engine after World War II. The rewards of the book begin with its epigraph, which Milosz attributes to an old Jew of Galicia. Quote, "When someone is honestly 55% right, that's very good and there's no use wrangling. And if someone is 60% right, it's wonderful. It's great luck. And let him thank God. But what's to be said about 75% right? Wise people say this is suspicious. Well, and what about 100% right? Who says he's 100% right is a fanatic, a thug, and the worst kind of rascal. What Milosz found in this epigraph, I cannot say, but it resonates today in large part because the old Jew he quotes is from Galicia, the medieval name for a region stretching from eastern Poland to western Ukraine, whose principal city, Lviv, is now overflowing with refugees fleeing a scorched earth invasion ordered by a 21st century fanatic claiming to be 100% right. Until recently, it might have been thought a bit harsh to call Vladimir Putin a fanatic, so skilled is he in the art of soft peddling. For example, his now famous 2017 treatise on the historical unity of Russians and Ukrainians begins on a seemingly conciliatory note. The wall that has emerged in recent years between the parts of what is essentially the same as spiritual space, to my mind, is our great common misfortune and tragedy. These are first and foremost the consequences of our own mistakes. Read on, however, you'll see that the mistakes being referred to are those of the Ukrainians, who, by aligning with those forces that have always sought to undermine our unity, are causing misfortune and tragedy for Russians. We'll resume that later as we turn to the fundamentals of the faith, volume 1. But when God, after having communicated the law to Moses on Mount Sinai in the tabernacle, communes with him as a friend, with friend, and Moses writes all the words of this law in a book, Deuteronomy 28, 31, 24, then Moses really became the pen of God. When God speaks to the prophets, behold, I put my words in thy mouth, and all the words that thou hearest thou shalt say to the people. Then these prophets become the very mouth of God. When Christ appears to John on Patmos and says to the angel of the church, write these things, this is an instance of verbal dictation. But just here we are amused at those weak-minded critics who, with hackneyed phrases, talk so glibly about mechanical instruments and mere verbal dictation. Does then a self-revelation of the Almighty and a making known of his counsels, a gracious act which exalts the human agent to be a co-worker with Jehovah, annihilate personal freedom? Or does it not rather enlarge that freedom and lift it up to a more higher and joyous activity? Am I then a mechanical instrument when, with deep devotion and with enthusiasm, I repeat after Christ word for word the prayer which he taught his disciples? The Bible is consequently a book which originated according to the will and with the cooperation of God, and as such is our guide to eternity, conducting man seemingly without a plan and yet without absolute certainty, all the way from first creation and from paradise and on to the higher creation and to the New Jerusalem. Proof of the Bible's inspiration. How does the Bible prove itself to be divinely inspired, heaven-given book, a communication from a father to his children, and thus revelation? First, by the fact that, as does no other sacred book in the world, it condemns men and all his works. It does not praise either his wisdom, his reason, his art, or any progress that he has made, but it represents him as being, in the sight of God, a miserable sinner, incapable of doing anything good and deserving only death and endless perdition. Truly a book which is thus able to speak and in consequence causes millions of men troubled in conscience to prostrate themselves in the dust crying, God be merciful to me, a sinner, must contain more than ordinary truth. And we're going to have to end this segment early.